So welcome to the first meeting of the Century Committee. I'm going to turn over, without further ado, the meeting to Chair of the Century Committee, Sharon Hamilton.
Hello, welcome. This is really exciting. We're really pleased that we could have this really distinguished panel of speakers come together to mark the anniversary of, obviously this is a baseball tragedy, of Ray Chapman's death 100 years ago today. So I'm going to introduce our three speakers. I'll read biographies for each of the three, biographical notes for each of the three. Then I'm going to ask each one 3 questions. And this should leave time at the end of our session should you have questions for them. You can send your questions during the panel if you wish. If things come up for you, you can write your question in the chat function and we'll get that and we can ask those questions of our panelists. Or as Bill was saying at the end of the question and answer session with the panelists that I'll be leading, you can also ask your questions live through the Zoom function. So without further ado, I'll read you our 3 panelists' bio notes, each one in the order that they're going to speak. So we have Don Jensen will be speaking first. Don is a noted baseball historian specializing in the dead ball era and the 19th century game. He is the editor of the award-winning annual volume, Baseball, a Journal of the Early Game. He is a member for the Society of American Baseball Research, obviously our group that we're here, and has written or co-authored many books and articles on the sport, including The Timeline History of Baseball. He was the 2015 winner of the Chairman's Award of the SABR 19th Century Committee. He is the Director of Russia and Strategic Stability at the United States Institute of Peace and an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. He follows his hometown San Francisco Giants from Alexandria, Virginia. So welcome to Don.
Yeah.
Then we'll have, speaking after Don, Mike Sowell. Mike Sowell is a former sports writer, author, and professor, now retired and living in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He is the author of 3 baseball books, The Pitch That Killed, which was a New York Times notable book of the year in 1989, and that's of course a book on the Chapman tragedy. He also wrote July 2nd, 1903, and One Pitch Away, which was a New York Times notable book of the year in 1995. He grew up in Houston, and he followed the Houston Colt 45s/Astros since their inception in 1962. After graduation from the University of Oklahoma, he spent 2 years in the Army, then wrote sports for newspapers in Houston, Irving, Freeport, El Paso, and Tulsa. He later worked as an author and editor of college sports publications before teaching at Oklahoma State University, where he helped start the nation's first undergraduate degree in sports media. He has covered the World Series, college football, and basketball championship games, but the highlight of his career was a one-on-one interview with Muhammad Ali, during which Ali performed magic tricks on him. And he also says that other interview highlights for him included interviewing members of the Chapman family and of the Cleveland Indians team for The Pitch That Killed. He has been a member of SABR since 1989 and now splits his baseball loyalties between the Astros and Cleveland Indians. So welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
And then our third speaker is going to be Kevin Trusty. Kevin Trusty is the author of Beyond Silence and Light, a book of short fiction coming soon. He is a marketing professional, copywriter, content producer, and blogger. He has worked with businesses in all sizes in virtually every industry on their marketing initiatives, content creation, and strategy. He is a member of the Society for American Baseball Research and maintains a blog on baseball history found at www.radborsrevenant.com. He has been published in dozens of newspapers, magazines, and websites, writing everything from advertorials and business profiles to event previews, historical features, and short fiction. He resides in Joliet, Illinois. So welcome, Kevin. So I'm really excited about having all of you here and honored actually to be interviewing the 3 of you. So as I said, I'll be asking each of the panelists 3 questions about this Chapman affair from 100 years ago today. And we'll start with Don, who will set the scene for us a bit by giving us some of the context. So Don, today marks the 100th anniversary of Ray Chapman's fatal beating by Carl Mays during a game between the Cleveland Indians and the New York Yankees. Could you set the stage for our panel discussion today by describing what happened during that fatal game?
Sure, glad to. First of all, Sharon and Bill, thank you very much a wonderful idea for a committee. And the Zoom focuses us to get beyond our normal parochial SABR affiliations to get to the broader issue of the society, and I'm very thankful. Sure, it obviously is one of the most famous games in history and takes place in the middle of one of my, I think, most riveting pennant races in history. And I say that as a National League man. At this time, 100 years ago, the Yankees and White Sox and Indians, or Naps, or whatever we want to call them, were locked in a very exciting pennant race. It was very much the cusp of one era beginning and the other ending. And one of the things about 1920 that makes it so interesting is that it had a little of both the old and the new. And that's one of the reasons why it makes so memorable. So Cleveland, the Yankees and the White Sox are battling in mid-August for the pennant. The Cleveland club goes east for a road trip and begins with the New York Yankees, then playing at the Polo Grounds. The weather was dark and rainy, 21,000 in attendance, and Cleveland very much needs a successful road trip to win the pennant. The game itself, I, Mike, and others have written about. Cleveland scores in the second and fourth inning, carries a 4-0 lead going into the top of the fifth, and then in the fifth, star shortstop Ray Chapman faces the it's hard to describe him, the somber underhands pitcher Carl Mays of the Yankees. I went back last night and watched the YouTube of Mays pitching, and it's very interesting to see how close his hand did go to the ground. Chapman led off, and I would say it's not yet clear, or there are contradictory versions, what the count was. But the count either 1-1 or the first pitch, Mays pitches Chapman high and inside, and the ball strikes Chapman in the head with a loud whack that convinced many people on the field, and I think and even in the stands, that he had actually hit it with his bat. The ball then rolls in front of the plate. Mays gets it, throws it to the Yankee first baseman, and Chapman is out. Chapman is also on the ground bleeding. And I want to get back to this in a second. Chappie's friends run to his aid. They escort him from the field. In the outfield, as you know, where the Polo Grounds clubhouse was, Tris Speaker says that Ray made a movement as though he was going to assault Chapman, and he was brought to the hospital nearby, and he passes away at 4 o'clock the next morning. The Yankees rally for 3 more runs later in the game, but the Indians win 4-3, and at least on the field that day, are triumphant. If I could raise 3 issues right here, Sharon, if that's all right, since we're talking about the game. I've gone over, and maybe Mike or Bill or you or somebody in the audience knows, I've gone over the sources again and again, and there's several questions which I still have after all of this. Number 1, as I said, was the count on Chapman. It seems that the evidence I've seen is contradictory, either 1-1 or the first pitch, and they vary. And there's no TV or instant replay at the time, so we don't really know. Second, it's just what did Chapman do when the ball was coming in? Either he looked at the pitch and froze, or as Chapman said shortly after the game, he stepped toward it. And I think Miller Huggins once said that Chapman always used the word pop back on inside pitches. So it's not clear to me after all of this happened, just what happened, because there were no consistent witnesses. Maybe Mike knows. And third is the issue of the ball itself ricocheting off Ray's head and going in front of home plate. The narrative is generally that it rolled in first, and I used that a minute ago, and Mays threw it to first base for the out. But there's another line of narrative that the ball was closer to home plate and one of the players put it in his pocket. And this issue of the throwing out to first base did not really happen. I think it probably did happen, but that's the third problem with the narratives of what happened. So number one, the count. Number two, what exactly Chapman did, stepping in, pulling back, or freezing, and you've got different accounts. And third is where did the ball go after it ricocheted off his head? I don't want to go off to the rest of the season right now, Sharon, but that would be my account of the game. And remember, the polo grounds did not have lights at this point. It was a hot, humid day, rainy, although the rain stopped before play began. So it was with no batting helmet, with a ball that Mays said had been nicked. It was almost tailor-made for an accident of some sort.
Thank you for raising those three questions. And in fact, the one about the count in particular, I've always been curious about, because you're right, in different official, biographies and things that have been written about this game, you do encounter both narratives. Was it the second pitch or was it the first pitch out? So I think I would ask that those are fantastic questions. Perhaps the people who are in the audience for this, if you have answers or opinions, please put them in the chat function. And then obviously Mike and Kevin, when we get to you, if you want to answer any of Don's questions, I encourage you to do so. I think those are all fantastic questions.
I could add, Sharon, I used 1 and 1 as the count on the article. I wrote it 16 years ago, so I don't remember which source I used.
Well, and I think I noticed I reread the Games Project one on Chapman yesterday, and that one said first pitch. And that seemed to be based on, because the writer said that the main source used was the Cleveland newspaper account. But again, that's one account. And it is a good question, because you're right, there are conflicting answers on that one. So I would thank you for asking those. Are fantastic questions. What I'll do is I'll move on with the other two questions for you. And then, as I said, if people have opinions, please send them in the chat, because those are all fantastic questions from John. All right, so the second question I had for you was about the continuation of the season. So as you said, this is an incredibly tight pennant race. The outcome of this game really matters. And of course, and actually for me, when I first read about it, it's shocking to me that the game continued. But I guess people just didn't, there wasn't any knowledge of how badly Chapman had been injured. So the game itself, the outcome of the game mattered, and they kept playing it. So my second question for you was, what happens to the American League pennant race as a result of this game, and what happened during this game?
Sure, Sharon. Obviously, people are shocked, dismayed, sickened by what happened. The next game, I believe, was called off. And the question becomes then, what is the effect not only on other teams, but on Chicago, New York, and Cleveland in particular? Tris Speaker, who was one reason I started to look at Ray's career, one of my heroes, was stunned by what happened. He was one of Ray's best players on the team. Cobb and others, especially I believe on Boston, but certainly in Detroit, talked about banning Mays from the game, and which of course would have had a decisive role on the pennant race. The Indians, Speaker came back on the 22nd of August, I believe, after the funeral. And by the way, there were pressures inside the team as well. One of the unpublished sources from the Hall of Fame file talks about Steve O'Neill and Speaker getting into a fight in the clubhouse about what funeral, Catholic or Protestant, would Ray's service go. But in any case, the Indians won 2 out of the next 9 games, seemed to falter. But under Speaker's leadership and bringing up in early September Joe Sowell to play shortstop after Lunt, Ray's replacement, hurt his leg, they rallied, won I think 24 of the last 31 games, and won the pennant. The Yankees, and I'm a Giants fan here, so the Yankees did not win, despite I think the fact that a lot of people thought that they would. There was a lot of animosity toward them because of Mays. Not just because they were Yankees, because they weren't the Yankees then. But Mays seemed not swayed at all. He had a number of good outings, including the following week. And Cleveland just rallied and managed to beat them out. And finally, Chicago, of course, the stories of the throwing of the 1919 World Series came out within 2 or 3 weeks. And I think that certainly had an effect on their performance. Cleveland wins, goes to play Brooklyn in the World Series and wins. Noteworthy, not only for Bill Wamsgann's triple play, but because they voted a full share to Mrs. Chapman of the winner's purse.
I've always thought there should be a movie. There needs to be a movie of the 1920
Talk
season.
to Mike, he can get
All right. Actually, yes, Mike could mention that when we get to Mike. So the third question is you wrote the SABR Bio Project entry on Ray Chapman. Since SABR is a society of researchers and writers, could you say something about what attracted you to writing your bio project piece on Chapman, and what was the most interesting experience you had while doing your research, and or what was the most interesting thing you discovered?
Well, excellent question, Bonnie. This is one of the first SABR biographies I wrote. As I said, it was 16 years ago. I think I wrote it just after the one on speaker. Just a couple points on the writing itself, and I'm a professional editor now, so I see where I would have changed a few words looking back. If you notice, I spent 2 days on the 2 paragraphs, maybe 3 days, about the actual beaming. I spent 3 days on it. And I ended up deciding not to describe the actual impact because we were not sure what happened. So when I sent the draft to the SABR editors at the time, they put it back in and they added their own language about describing the actual impact. And I insisted, and I usually go along with editors, what they say. No, I insisted they wanted to take it out. I wanted the ambiguity to be there, and I tried to capture it in the narrative. The second thing would be, and probably our distinguished Ohioans on the panel would know more about it than I would, is that Ray's sister was alive till the mid-1990s. And I think maybe Mike must have met her. And she has a wonderful interview with her in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, I think, in the mid-90s. And she's about 94. And she said, well, it happened a long time ago, but she's still a Cleveland Indian fan after 75 years. And the final point, I guess, would just be the tragedy of Mrs. Chapman's life, losing her child and dying at a young age. So those are the things that I think are most, that I discovered that were most interesting. And I have a question for the group, which is that the ban on the spitball appeared to, in a limited form, appeared to happen before the season. Is that right, Sharon? In February or March, which was then broadened. And I didn't know that until I actually wrote the article. I always thought that the ban on the spitball was directly related as the helmet rule to Chapman's death, but it appears to have been just before.
It was just before, and it was in February that the trick pitches of all sorts were banned, not just the spitball, and mud ball as well, the emery ball. But I would be, since we're asking questions of the people who are attending today, I would love to hear more if anyone knows about the rule changes around the ball, because my understanding is that their managers encouraged more balls in play after the Chapman tragedy. I don't know whether there was an official rule change or whether that was just an understood thing that was generally encouraged. I can't remember. I'm sure, Mike, you must have talked about this in your book, but this is something that I'm not totally clear on when that was made official or if it was made official. And so the rule changes do interest me. And it is fascinating. Many people still think, and in fact, there's a lot of disinformation on the internet. If you check Wikipedia pages and so forth about the spitball, there's still a lot of information out there that links it directly, the banning of the trick pitches, to Chapman's death, and it came earlier. So there you go. There's lots of work for SABR researchers in fixing the internet on that one.
And just to add a point to that, there were some pitchers who I believe had they thrown junk pitches before the rule went into effect, they were allowed to continue to throw.
Yes.
Them. Some were grandfathered in, so Mays could have been included in that.
Well, Chapman was killed with a fastball. It wasn't a trick pitch, and so, but yes, you're completely right about the spitball pitchers were grandfathered, and actually they lasted for a long time. But there's certainly, again, there's this ambiguity in the 20s about the rule changes and what exactly changed when, and when was it officially changed and when did it actually happen in practice is a good question you're raising as well, Kevin. They changed the spitball on paper, but people who had it as their primary pitch were allowed to keep doing it. I think there were 17 of them, so that's a lot of pitchers who were allowed to keep using the spitball.
And as far as inserting new balls into the game, that became huge right after this. And I think that was one of the factors really maybe getting hit, because it was in the 5th inning. Ball was filthy dirty. If it
exactly. And it was a great game. And I think people really agree that that was a contributing factor to, but it goes back to Don's question. Did Chapman even see the ball?
Right.
There have been people who say that he didn't move. He didn't. So anyway, we'll put that out there again. If there's experts who want to weigh in on rule changes and also practice changes, I'm really interested in how or when the instruction was given by managers to have more balls in play. I don't remember reading something really specific on that. So thank you very much, Dawn. Those were fantastic answers. We'll move to Mike with your 3 questions. So my first question for you was, just like I imagine many SABR members joining us for this panel discussion today, I loved your book on the Chapman tragedy, The Pitch That Killed. It is an extremely well-written, thoroughly researched book, and throughout you managed to make events from 100 years ago fresh and vivid, as if we had been to see them ourselves. The part of your book that made me cry on the bus when I read it was when you described Ray Chapman's funeral at St. John's Cathedral. You wrote, "There had been more than 300 floral offerings sent to the cathedral, and they were banked high against the sanctuary rail. Among them was an immense floral blanket from 20,023 persons who had contributed 10 cents each toward the Flower from a Fan Fund. The blanket contained 2,063 flowers, and the remainder of the fund money was to go towards a bronze memorial tablet in Chapman's honor at League Park, the Indians' home field." For me, this passage captured just how deeply Ray Chapman had been loved, both as a ball player and as a person, and it showed the immensity of the loss arising from his death. Based on the time you spent researching and writing about Ray Chapman's life, could you tell us something about your personal impressions of Chapman as an individual and as an athlete?
Okay, thank you, Sharon, and it's great to be on this panel and with so many distinguished researchers. I admire all of you guys, respect all of your work. And before I answer your first question, I think I'll go in and respond to some of the questions put out there by Dawn. First of all, I got my accounts of the game from reading the newspapers themselves, the Cleveland and New York newspapers of that game. And as I recall, they were all consistent that he was the first batter of the 5th inning, and it was the first pitch. The only thing I've ever seen that gave a different count were things that had been, written about that not well resourced or sourced accounts of that game. So I'm pretty sure it was the first pitch, and that he did not move. Several of the players talked about that he froze. And Terry Turner, who formerly had played for the Indians and still were very close to the team, and he had played with Chapman when Ray first came into the American League, or joined the Indians. But Turner described when he was hit by a pitch and he froze at the pitch, he never moved because he was so fascinated by the ball. He could see it coming toward him. He knew it was going to hit him, but he could not move. He was so fascinated. And he compared it to you're watching a snake that is about to strike and you know it's going to bite you, but you can't move. And that was commented on at the time, that Chapman never moved, and some of the players talked about it. So I believe he pretty well froze on that pitch for whatever reason. As for the issue about what happened to the ball, I think Don, the 2 accounts he gives, I think one of those stems from a former sports writer who wrote an article in the 1970s claiming that he had the so-called death ball. And he gave this bizarre story about how Charlie Jameson had picked the ball up at home plate, put it in his back pocket, played the rest of the game with this ball in his pocket, which would have been illegal. And then he took it out later, threw it in his locker, and kept it all those years. And the sports writer who grew up near the Jameson family in New Jersey claimed that one of Charlie Jameson's brothers, in the article, he claimed Charlie Jameson gave it to him. But I actually tracked down that writer who was still alive in 1985 when I researched the book. And his story obviously is false, because every account of the game described the ball going back to Mays throwing to Wally Pipp, and there was no contradiction. I've read several game accounts of the day, both New York and Cleveland newspapers. And there were some other things that this man said about the ball. And then when he was going to show me the ball, he couldn't find it. And then he finally found one, and it had paint on it. And I don't think the seams matched up to that it was a ball from that year. So anyway, it's a very bizarre story. And I'll talk more about this later, but I included that issue in the original manuscript I sent, but it had to be cut for length. So the epilogue that I wrote did not get included, but it's now in the ebook that's available through Summer Game Books, and it's on Amazon. So I think I've covered those issues. As far as my impressions of Ray Chapman, it's well documented what a popular, outgoing player he was, a very cheerful man. Everyone loved him, even players on opposing teams. So he was one of those unique individuals that when he would walk into a room, he attracts everyone to him. And to come from the background he did as the son of a coal miner, to grow up poor and then go into baseball. He wasn't a well-educated man, but he was very talented. He could play the piano. He was a great singer. And he actually, not only was he popular among other ball players, but he was friends with Al Jolson, Will Rogers, people like that. And the fact that he could somehow, this poor son of a coal miner could end up marrying Kathleen Daly, or Katie Daly, you know, the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Cleveland, is phenomenal. And he spent a lot of time at the Daly house. They welcomed him in there. He was like a son to them. And he would joke and play around with them. He set up at one point he got a dummy that he brought into the house, and he set it up in the hallway. I think it was actually maybe something that they use in sewing to model a dress or a suit. But anyway, and he named this dummy, and he would talk to him, and he would keep the Daly family in stitches with that. So he was just a great person. As far as the kind of player he was, everything described him as very flashy defensively. So when I was writing this, I always envisioned him as kind of a early version of a Ozzie Smith, you know, making kind of acrobatic plays in the field. And he was also the fastest player in the league. He had won one of the race they had in 1918 in Boston, you know, where they had different players compete in different events. It's kind of like a pitch, hit, and run competition. So great ball player. So I think he's a combination, maybe Ozzie Smith and a 1980s era shortstop, Alan Trammell, you know, a good hitter. So really great person. And I got to know his sister, Margaret Joy. And she was just phenomenal because she was still living at the time I did my research. So when I went and visited her at her home in West Virginia, she just welcomed me into her home. She was extremely nice and personable. The people in Cleveland who later met her when I think she was honored when they unveiled the plaque, the sportsmanship plaque that had been made for Ray back in 1920, and over the years had gotten lost and then was found again. And it's at the ballpark now, out in their little garden beyond the outfield fences. So you can see it there. So just a great family. a great person. And one other thing about them at the time, Margaret Joy, when I interviewed her, she was in her early 80s and she lived to be 104. And she told me at the time that the Chapman family, all of the members of the family were very long lived. And her parents back in the early 1900s lived into their 90s, which was phenomenal back in that era. So I think, you know, Ray Chapman would have been alive in 1985 when I was researching and writing this book. And, you know, I could have met him. So no telling how long he would have lived. So, and one other point, something that that Don had in his profile of Ray on the SABR site. Don, you mentioned that in 1915, the White Sox tried to trade to get Ray Chapman, and the Indians wouldn't trade him. So the White Sox finally settled for Shoeless Joe Jackson. This great hit. That's quite a consolation prize. But, you know, Jackson, you know, as we all know, Shoeless Joe Jackson, he was illiterate, and Jackson wasn't a leader. Well, Ray Chapman was a leader. And, you know, Trish Speaker was the leader on that team, but Ray Chapman also was a team leader, and he was a very moral, ethical man. And at the time, he was known for his sportsmanship. So I've always wondered, and Don, after reading your piece, I kind of wonder what would have happened if the White Sox had gotten Ray Chapman instead of Carl Mays. And personally, I believe there would not have been a Black Sox scandal, because I don't think that Chick Gandil, the ringleader of that scandal, could have influenced enough players on that team to go along with him. And they would have had Ray Chapman at shortstop instead of Swede Risberg, one of the key figures in that scandal. So could have changed baseball history for a different reason. So whatever Ray did, if he had lived, if things had gone differently and he'd played for the White Sox, either way, he was going to be a change in some ways, but have a tremendous impact on the game of baseball and its history.
That's a very moving, and you know, I think also he did change history, because as Don was saying, it was an incredibly tight pennant race that year, and I think the Indians, it did affect their play, that they were playing for him, and in not only the pennant but the World Series as well, and so he did change history even by not being there. I think that was part of the reason that they won. Anyway, fantastic answer, and very sad what you say about the fact that he might have lived past 100 if this tragedy had not happened today, 100 years ago. So the second question I had for you was, The Pitch That Killed is a dual biography, a book on the life of Ray Chapman, but also of the life of the man who killed him, pitcher Carl Mays. Could you tell us why you felt compelled to write about Mays as well as Chapman, and also something about your impressions of Mays as a ball player and as a person?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I did set out to write a biography of Ray Chapman, but once I researched it and got into the story, it was obvious you cannot tell the story of Ray Chapman or Carl Mays without the story of the other one. So these men were so closely linked, and it's a tragic story because both men were victims of that one pitch. And of course, it cost Ray Chapman his life, but it cost Carl Mays his enduring reputation in baseball. And I think it also cost both men their places that they would have earned in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Because if Chapman had kept playing, he was on track, and Bill James documented this very well in one of his baseball almanacs, that Ray Chapman was on pace to become a Hall of Fame player. And unfortunately, he just did not have a long enough career to be considered now. So I really, as much as I would like to see him there, unless he gets some kind of a special honor or place there, I don't think he'll make it. But there's still a move to get Carl Mays into the Hall of Fame. And we've talked about what a great pitcher he was, and had the unusual way he threw with this underhand pitch. And Bill James made the point that Carl Mays, not only was he a so-called submarine or underhand pitcher, But of all the submarine pitchers in baseball history, Carl Mays was the only one who was still a power pitcher. So he was throwing hard, and it's coming from these unusual angles. And related to whether Chapman moved or where the pitch was, the Muddy Rule, the catcher for the Yankees, swore that the pitch was in the strike zone, and that Chapman actually was leaned over the plate, so his head was in the strike zone when he was hit. And so there, there's some controversy over that, and controversy over whether Mays intended to throw at him, hit Chapman, which many of the Indians ball players think. But Don also raised the point of the move to get Mays, the boycott games that Mays pitched are having thrown out of baseball. And that was widespread. And so it was not just some idle talk. The Senators, Washington team, they and the Indians were very serious about doing that. And the Tigers and Red Sox were kind of leaning that way, but were a little bit on the fence. But Van Johnson took firm steps to prevent that. So we never had that. But as far as what kind of person Mays was, his reputation as a loner and kind of a somber man, as one of his teammates once said, he always looks like a man who has a constant toothache. So he never looked happy. He was not popular. He didn't socialize with his teammates. But to me, that painted a portrait of kind of a sour, kind of ill-spirited man. And my opinion of Carl Mays as a person changed when you see his reputation after baseball, because I respect, first of all, that he could continue to pitch at the level he did. But in post-baseball, Carl Mays he didn't have a lot of friends, but the friends from baseball that he had were very devoted and loyal to him. And this included people like Johnny Pesky, the great Red Sox shortstop from the 1940s, who is also from Oregon and knew Mays. And, Mays was, he was not so unpopular that he could not get a job as a scout in baseball. And for a while, he was even a scout for the Cleveland Indians. And recently, after the book came out, I was able to meet a young man here in Tulsa, by coincidence, who is one of the descendants of Carl Mays. And so, he's a nice, personable young man. I mean, he's not some angry guy going around like you kind of picture a brooding, angry Carl Mays. So I think he was a complicated man, but, more than just this dour, mean-spirited guy.
Thank you for that. I mean, it's one of the things I really appreciated about your book is that we do get to know both people. And one of the things that impressed me is that they were both self-made men. They both came from really hard Scrabble backgrounds and made it into the major leagues. And that takes a real strength of character. So any way you slice it, these are two people who had real strength of character. They were real, tough people, strong people. The third question I had for you is you once mentioned to me that you rewrote The Pitch That Killed from the beginning 4 times. I think I would have given up after twice, so I was very impressed with that. Could you tell us something about the process of turning Chapman and Mays' stories into a dual biography, including what some of the most challenging and most rewarding parts of the writing, rewriting, and editing process were for you?
Well, first of all, I've always considered myself a better rewriter than writer. So it was very difficult to start. I had never written any story of this length. I was a sports writer at the time. I spent 15 years writing sports for newspapers. So we wrote short stories, obviously, but you had to learn how to write tight, to write tight and to keep your stories to a certain length. But anyway, when I started, I really had to figure out how to start the book, where to begin, how to structure it. So I would start writing and I might write 30 or 40 pages and decide, no, this isn't good. So rather than throw away those pages, I would print them out and I would stack them up next to the chair at my desk. And eventually that stack got up to seat level, but I stayed with it and finally hit on the opening that I went with. And from there, I just kept going. And you mentioned the rewrites. It is true. I did 4 rewrites of that, but the first draft was not that moving. It was, I had the facts, but it didn't have a feel or a personality to it. So that's what I kept doing to get to that. And it was not torture for me. I enjoyed it. And I had something on paper or on screen at this time. So at least I had something to work with, and I enjoyed doing that.
You also mentioned about the 100 pages. You'll have to tell them the story about the 100 pages.
That's I sent the manuscript in, and I wrote it on an old Apple IIe. So I don't know if any of you are Mac versus PC people, but one thing I'll say about the Macintosh, I carried that Apple IIe. It's a handheld, it's really just a word processor, but it's called a computer. But I carried it around. I still have it. And I got that out when I was teaching at Oklahoma State after more than 15 years. It's actually about 20 years after I'd used it, and it had been up in the attic and moved to different places. But I plugged it all up and it still works. So that says something about the old Apple products. But once I had an agent, thanks to a guy I worked with who had written several books, a guy named Jay Cromley, who had a New York City agent at, anyway, he was very, having an agent is critical. Well, he shopped the book around and it got rejected by 3 publishing houses. And then finally Macmillan bought the book, and they had a great editor there. And he's responsible for the pitch that killed getting into print, because had it not been for him, I don't think anyone else would have bought the manuscript. But his name is Rick Wolf. He's now has a sports talk radio show in New York City at WFAN, WFAN. I think that's the big sports talk show there. But anyway, everything was fine. It takes about a year from the time they get the book until it gets into print. Well, about a week or 2 before the deadline when it was going to go to the printers, there was a change made. This wasn't Rick's idea, but he was the one who had to call me and tell me, okay, we got 2 weeks to go and you need to shorten the book. And I said, that's no problem. We do this all the time in newspapers. You cut a story or tighten it up. And I said, how much do I need to cut? Well, it was 430 pages printed out on the old printer I had. And he said, well, 100 pages. So I had to, that's why the epilogue got cut right away. That was a big chunk right there. And there were other parts. Some of the stuff, especially like on Carl May's background, that I realized I'd just written too much that wasn't relevant to the story or to telling his story. And after I did those 2 major cuts, I went back and started rewriting again to tighten everything. And it's amazing how much you can cut out of a story if you will go in and you can cut out unnecessary words where you've used 3 or 4 words and you could use 1. You do that, anyway, it was an interesting process, and I had a pretty strict deadline to get that done. And I was still working at the Tulsa Tribune at the time, but the end result was it made the book even better because it really tightened it up. It made it much more readable, and there was still that life in it. And I'll close on getting back to your final point, or your issue about the scene from the funeral, how that made you cry. Well, writing the book, and I knew that I was getting there because in the 4th or 5th go-throughs on writing that book, there were several parts where I had to stop because I actually did cry at certain parts. It is such a sad, sad story. And the events, as several people have pointed out, it sounds like something that out of a Hollywood film that you watch and say, well, that could never happen. But it's just an amazing story. The Indians come back, the tragedies that continued to stalk the Katie Daly or Katie Chapman, Ray's wife, and his daughter who was born who both, within 6 years, they were both gone also. So anyway, it was an interesting experience.
Thank you for that. I saw Kevin shaking his head when you described I think everyone here who's written anything, the idea of being given a week to take 100 pages out of a book is, you are a strong man.
Well, I tell you what, it's funny because when I was teaching at Oklahoma State, and we called it typewriting over there, and then in academia, by contrast, when people write academic articles, the point is to pad it as much as you can, kind of like a high school student writing answers on essay tests. You're padding it as much as you can, throwing in everything.
This was the opposite. Well, thank you for that wonderful story, and thank you for all your answers, including the ones to Don's questions. Those were fantastic. So our last speaker is Kevin Trusty, and we're going to ask him his 3 questions now. And this is a shift away from, we've heard Don and Mike talking about the historical events of 100 years ago today, and Kevin is basically going to take us to how these events inspired him in his new project. So looking forward to the future for his instead of to the past. So my first question for you, Kevin, your forthcoming book of short fiction, Beyond Silence and Light, includes a story in which Ray Chapman appears as a character. Could you tell us something about what made you want to write about Ray Chapman, and why did you think Ray Chapman would make a good character in a short story?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sharon. It's an honor to be here with such awesome researchers and be part of this. I've always been fascinated with Chapman's story, tragic though it is. He was a very well-liked guy in the prime of a potentially Hall of Fame career. Ironically, Joe Sowell, who became his replacement, is in the Hall of Fame. So that's an interesting wrinkle I always enjoy reading about. But he had a loving wife, he had a daughter on the way. All these things is very unfair to be taken from all that, in any situation. And I started thinking one day, actually, as I read Mike's book, what would be like a fitting baseball afterlife for a guy like that? I've written a little bit about the 1920 Indians and a bit about Carl Mays, but not about Chapman exclusively. But here's a guy who would have had plenty of kind of unfinished business on the field. In a way, and it dawned on me he'd be a really good character to kind of drop right back in the middle of the game, so to speak. And I was flipping through W.P. Kinsella's great book, Shoeless Joe, which of course became the movie Field of Dreams. And there's just a quick little blink and you'll miss it passage in there where the character of Ray Kinsella, who's later played by Kevin Costner, asks Shoeless Joe and some of the other guys what happens to the players when they disappear into the cornfield. Where do they go? What becomes of you? Of course, he gets a weird, ambiguous answer, but when that passage kind of stuck out at me at the time, and I started thinking about Chapman again, and then thinking about Mike's book and thinking about the whole story, and I'm like, you know what? There might be something here that's worth exploring, because there's a lot of unanswered questions. Both in the real life story and then of course the Kinsella's fiction. So that kind of ignited it, and it was just one breadcrumb trail after another after that.
Very cool. So my second question is, could you tell us something about the plot of the story that Chapman appears in? And I realize you might not want to give away your ending, but could you tell us in general what your story is about and something about what you inspired you to write it? Well, you've given us a little bit of that now, but if there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, so I thought it'd be really interesting not just to tell the story, but I love writing historical fiction anyway. It's kind of enjoyable to just take a real life person or event and then build a new world around it. So the story has Ray Chapman as the main character. It's told first person through his eyes. We see what he sees and experiences, and it begins right after Mays delivered the pitch. And so that's kind of the beginning of it. And he doesn't really know where he is after that. There's some kind of amnesia. He's got confusion. He doesn't really know what he's supposed to be doing. Luckily, he has a very trusted friend that's right there and kind of guiding him through this whole thing. I won't spoil who the friend is, but little by little, he starts remembering. Things start coming back to him. Things start making sense. And toward the end, he kind of gets this reward, so to speak, and everything becomes clear to him. And it's just okay, this is where I'm at. This is what this is. This was worth it. You know, all the everything to that point. The inspiration came from his story in real life. Of course, it's tragic, but it's fascinating. It's a very important part of the game's history because so many things have happened, rules changes and so forth since then that we're still seeing the effects of today. And reading a lot of Kinsella too. WP was one of my favorite authors. There was no one who could, not just Shoeless Joe, but he wrote a lot of books on baseball fiction, and nobody could really blend old school baseball and that character-driven fantasy and immersive plots like he did. I mean, all his stories are just fantastic. So I kind of just merged the two, and that was sort of the inspiration behind it, really. I knew I wanted to explore some of those unanswered questions, and I thought it'd be best told from Ray's perspective because, you know, who better to tell the story of a kind of a tranquil, mysterious baseball heaven, so to speak, than someone who is taken from the game during a game, you know?
Wow, fantastic. I love your starting point that it happens with the pitch. That's so cool. And also, I totally agree. If there's anyone on here who hasn't read Shoeless Joe, that is a fantastic book. It is such a well-written book, and it's been sort of overshadowed by a fantastic movie. So people don't necessarily know what a great book it is. It's such a fantastic book. So I'm very excited about your project. So my third question for you is, in general, a lot of SABR members, including yourself, are used to writing factual nonfiction articles about baseball. What made you want to engage in creative writing about baseball? Have you done this sort of thing before? And what would you say are the most difficult and the most rewarding things about writing fictional stories involving baseball players?
Sure. I dove back into fiction writing a couple years ago. You know, I've long been writing feature stories for newspapers and magazines, and of course my own blog about baseball, and done a lot of guest posting on. Some of you might be familiar with Old Time Baseball Photos on Facebook. I've done a lot of guest content contribution for those guys. That's a great Facebook page. If anybody has not visited that yet, it's fantastic for the history of the game. And then working in marketing as a copywriter and producing a lot of business and marketing content by day, everything I was writing was nonfiction. And I love doing that. That's wonderful, but it's a little bit limiting in some ways because there's facts you're dealing with. There's some parameters around every project, and I always do it kind of in a storytelling fashion, of course. But you know, fiction is freeing, and where nonfiction is a little bit limited, there's really no boundaries with fiction. So it felt natural to write baseball fiction because I already know the language. I've already written so much baseball nonfiction that it just felt easy to transition into that. And it's fun to flip that around to just take, like I mentioned, historical fiction earlier, take a real life person or event, but then create new elements and a new world around it and see what happens. You know, in the case of this chapter in my book about Ray, once I had the premise down, it kind of wrote itself. I mean, I took some fantasy style elements and then his real life story and just put them together, and it was really neat to see where it turned because you know, the most difficult thing about writing baseball fiction is not to get too absurd, right? I mean, as freeing and as you know, open as writing fiction is, I try to keep it very realistic and close to the character's traits and mannerisms and the way, in this case, in the way Chapman was regarded. And so it kind of feels like it feels real. It feels this is actually how Ray Chapman would react in this situation.
Well, we can trust you with your SABR research credentials that the facts will be good. And it'll seem real even if you've taken it off into the fantasy world. Anyway, your project sounds really exciting, and I'm particularly happy that you were able to join this panel because it allows us to end what is a tragic story on a happier note, like that Ray Chapman in your fiction is going to live on. So we have only 5 minutes left in our scheduled time, and we don't know whether we will actually get kicked off. And even if we don't, we've been told we should be fairly respectful of time. So Bill, you've been watching the questions. Do you have some of the questions from the chat room? Are there any general questions a lot of people seem to have asked that maybe we could throw out to our panelists before we close?
I think you might be muted.
Mike, we can't hear you if you're talking, Bill.
Yeah, you're right.
There we go.
There's only a little bit of overlap. There are 5 or 6 questions that have been asked to this point. I don't believe we're going to get kicked off. So I think, and very few people have left, only 3 people during the course of the hour. So there seems to be interest. I suggest we all plan, if we can, to stay just a little bit longer and try to address one of the questions, or some of the questions. One of them that Roger asked, I believe, was answered early on, but I will enunciate it here. Was there any indication that Chapman had squared around to bunt on the pitch? Don?
We're just throwing it out for everyone.
Oh, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, every question is for everyone at this point.
All right. Well, I would say no. There was no indication of it because the description was that he didn't move at all. He just froze. So that's my belief of what happened.
Tara asked if
Chapman
had been, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Mike. However, I saw one source that's talked about him moving his rear foot, but just one source as if to indicate he might be trying to bunt. I just don't know. But without more information, I would agree with Mike.
Even if he did move his back foot to bunt, then, you know, that's not like squaring around. You know, you hadn't got very far into changing his position.
Exactly. So I agree with Mike.
Okay. Tara had asked if Chapman had been known at all for crowding the plate. If he was indeed if his head was indeed in the strike zone, was that unusual for him?
Well, I'll start real quickly. That one of the ironies is that day, instructional book on baseball by John Sheridan, a noted sports writer at that time, where he taught young people how to play the game and use stars of the game to illustrate things. And he chose Ray Chapman as having the ideal batting stance at the plate. So, because ironically, Sheridan pointed out or said that Chapman, because of this stance, he knew how not to get hit by a pitch. But I think that he was, anyway, he was, you know, it was very unlikely. No one thought it would be him. So something did have to happen, like he just froze on that pitch. And someone else might have more to add to that.
Like we talked about a little bit earlier, I think the fact that he froze on it, I mean, if you think about the different elements of the pitch itself, I mean, it was a gloomy day. It was late in the game. The ball very likely was dirty, covered with mud and tobacco and Lord knows what else. And then, of course, Mays's difficult delivery. You know, even if you did see the pitch coming in, I mean, he was probably just kind of mesmerized by it for that one little second. You know, anybody who's played the game and got hit by a pitch, you know, some of them you just can't get out of the way of. You know, ask Anthony Rizzo. And for that one example. But, yeah, I mean, it was just a perfect combination of little things like that, I think, that contributed to it.
Can I add one quick thing? I read an article recently because, you know, one of the other players in the minor leagues who was hit by a pitch and killed when I wrote my book, and it's in the book, was a guy named Johnny Dodge, which is an ironic name, but he was hit by Tom Shotgun Rogers. But a recent article, and I can't remember the name of the historical magazine, but it pointed out that when Johnny Dodge batted, he had an unusual habit of when he would swing at the pitch, he would actually run forward in the batter's box and as he swung. And supposedly when the pitch came in from Shotgun Rogers, Dodge was moving forward, getting ready to swing when the ball hit him. I don't know if that's true, but I thought that was really a ironic twist. And of course, the Shotgun Rogers later was briefly on the same team as Carl Mays in the major leagues.
I mentioned that there was a bit of an overlap. Two people, Jay and Steve, both asked if umpires were later urged to change balls more frequently.
Yes, they were right after that incident. It was immediate, I believe.
Yeah.
And,
They would,
sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
well, I was just gonna say in those days, it was very common if no one hit it out of the park, play the entire 9 innings with the same ball, you know.
And even, I remember during World War II, fans were asked to throw balls, foul balls back onto the field. I don't remember it. I remember reading about it. Stan asked if any umpires, there were 2 umpires, I believe, that worked the game. Did either of them or any other umpires comment at the time?
Well, the home plate umpire, Tommy Connolly, became a part of the controversy because one of the things Mays did that did not endear himself to the other players, especially Chapman's friends on the Indians, was that Mays got the baseball after, you know, the play had been made and the out had recorded, but Mays got the ball and was showing it to the umpire, trying to argue that Connolly should have thrown the ball out of the game because it had a big scrape on it. And so Mays, who liked to throw balls like that because he was a trick pitcher. And yet here he is, and then he's trying to place the blame for this on the umpire. So that's one of the things that angered people about how Mays reacted to this. That and the fact he never apologized to the Chapman family or expressed his condolences to them.
I was really interested in reading the book to read about your mention about his daughter, Ray. I was wondering what happened, and yeah, she got measles and died which she was 6 years old or something, I think.
Right.
Did any of the panelists, Michael asked this, if any of the panelists talked to players who have suffered serious beatings in their subsequent careers?
I did not for that book. I don't know about the other 2. I did talk to, you know, Bill Wamscans was Chapman's teammate, you know, and he talked about that, and Joe Sowell, of course, and so they both,
yeah,
you know, no one like Carl May's teammate Chick Fuster, who had been beaten seriously in spring training, and that really impacted Mays. That was another irony of this incident.
There's another little bit of irony too, and you know, we've mentioned that word a couple of times around this situation. You know, Mays definitely had the reputation of, you know, being difficult to bat against because of his delivery and because of his occasion he would hit a batter. Just 2 years before, the same thing happened with Speaker. Mays hit him on the head in a game, and then 2 years later, almost to the day, this happens with Chapman. I always thought that was an interesting bit of irony.
You did a great article on that where you mentioned that. I remember reading that.
Thanks. Yeah, that I was very wide-eyed when I came across that fact. I was like, wow, that doesn't help his reputation too much. But
No.
Yeah. Richard asked the question: was it correct that that Chapman walked off the field? I believe that my memory is that he walked to some degree for a period of time.
He did get up, and he eventually he came up. He initially went to a sitting position and was bleeding from the ear, but and they did administer ice initially, but he did stand and had to walk from the batter's box all the way out to the center field fence where the door was to the clubhouse. And I think he made it as far as second base, and then he started to sink to the ground. So he had 2 teammates, one on each side, and they quickly grabbed him and draped him around their shoulders and, you know, pretty well carried or dragged him the rest of the way.
That's what I recall. The only other question we have to this point was from Richard. No, was from Mike. His name is Mike, but the question is mainly to Mike as to whether you're working on another book. We know that Kevin's working on something, but maybe for Don and Mike, if there's another book. He said he enjoyed the various books you have written, and it was specifically asking if there was another book you are working on.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm honored that, that he liked the books and that 2 of them are still available. But no, I spent 10 years doing those 3 books, and I have a very understanding wife who supported me through that, even though, I'd go to work and then come home and go out to my little office and work, and vacations were spent on that. So I took a break from it, and then had to get other jobs. I didn't make enough money writing books to support myself solely. And then when I got to Oklahoma State and got into teaching, I had to do the academic research and writing. And so there I researched the history of sports writers and the early sports writers, because those guys were fascinating. And I shouldn't say just those guys, because there were incidents of even women writing sports in those days. And it was particularly going back to the 1890s, and when the Players League was, the one season the Players League had, Sporting Life had the correspondent to cover the Pittsburgh Players League was a woman named Ella Black. And at least that's the byline on the stories. And there's some controversy about whether if that was really a woman writing that, or if it was a gimmick. But the famous, who was it? Harry Wright, who invented the first baseball writer. Help me out here, senior moment, Bill. Back in the 1890s. Anyway, he was still writing baseball then, and he confirmed he had met this woman and that she was writing it. So I thought that was interesting. But anyway, now I'm retired, and it's too much work to write a book now.
Is there a viable documentary that might be in the works?
I'm glad you asked that. Just recently, in the past week, the book previously had been optioned for a movie, Come Aboard Productions. The funding wasn't there at that time, but Pam Sullivan, who was the producer, was trying to do that. She stayed interested, and now Pam got teamed up with a man named Art Horan, Horan, who has he's got about 5 documentaries he's made. And so the book it's in a shopping agreement to get funding to go into a documentary. So I'm optimistic that will happen.
Well, there are quite a few people that would welcome the opportunity to see the final results, certainly. Steve Steinberg, if you wanted to unmute yourself, you said you'd like to ask a question. If you want to unmute yourself and do that, and then Sharon, you should conclude the meeting.
And my question, if you can hear me okay, is directed primarily to Mike, but the others can weigh in. I thought I remember, Mike, that you had mentioned, and I've come across that the trick pitches were banned at the beginning before the 1920 season, and I think white balls were planned to be introduced more regularly. And I recall coming across the fact that the owners were complaining about the expense of too many balls being used, and Ban Johnson directed, I think probably in the early summer, that they back off a little bit. And of course, after Ray Chapman's death, it was just accepted. The white balls had to be kept in play. Did you come across anything on this? And if you did the National League have a similar directive that Ban Johnson gave the AL? And I'll have to dig up where, if you don't have that, where I came across that.
Well, no, well, first of all, it's good to hear from you, Steve, because, you've helped me out a lot over the years and sent me a lot of stuff on the old sports writers. But yes, I think you described it just as what I got in my research, that the season started and initially they were going to change the balls more often, kind of as part of the new pitching rules. And then the owners complained because back then, baseball was it wasn't really a shoestring operation, but it wasn't guaranteed that you were going to make money as owning a baseball team. And so the owners were very frugal. So, that did lead to the fact that then they started keeping the ball in play more often. So the ball that hit Chapman was apparently was damaged or scuffed up. And then they had to go back to the original directive. And I think that Johnson did that immediately. And I'm not sure about the National League. I can't answer that. I just kind of assumed that this was all baseball owners coming to these agreements, but I can't say that definitively.
A question just came in from Jay. This only goes back 50 years or so, but he says in Boston, we still remember the tragedies of Harry Aganis and Tony Conigliaro and wondered if Cleveland fans recall Chapman's death in a similar way. It, of course, being 100 years ago tomorrow that he actually died, and 100 years ago today that he was actually struck.
I would say that they do, because I've visited his grave, and there's people who live in Cleveland. I've gotten to know a lot of people up in Cleveland. First of all, it's a great baseball city, but they routinely go out to Chapman's grave, and they put baseballs or little bats and flowers on the grave. And one of the women who is the writer for this project, if it does become a documentary, Danielle Alberico, she lives in Cleveland, and she's going to be out at Chapman's grave on Monday. And the question now is, will they get the usual big crowds that they have? But every year on the anniversary of it, I think they do that. And also when Cleveland will tragically lose the 7th game of a World Series or a playoff series, the Indians fans kind of pay tribute to Chappie at that time.
Looks like Vince is,
if I can jump in for just a minute, we were talking in the chat about this. In 2007 is when they found the plaque that was at League Park, and then it was at Cleveland Stadium for a while. Now, like you said, it's at Heritage Park at Progressive Field. But there was actually this idea when they found the plaque, and the Indians actually advanced to the American League Championship Series this year. That there was this idea that the plaque kind of offered a little bit of good fortune, kind of like the story of the Eddie Grant plaque and its revitalization in San Francisco might have done for the Giants.
That's a good point. And Bill, if I could throw in one other thing, just a little bit of a different subject, but real quickly. There is some talk now that the Cleveland team will have to will change its name, because we now are a little more sensitive to the fact that the Native Americans are the only race of people that we use as mascots and team names. So, but the before they were the Indians, Cleveland was the Naps when Napoleon Lajoie played for them, and so the team was named after a player then. And then they chose the name Indians after Lajoie left because of Louis Sockalexis, a very popular Indian ball player for the Indians before the Lajoie era. And so if they do change their name, I think it'd be a very fitting tribute, and it would be a great thing, which some people have voted for or want to see happen, is to name the team the Chappies to honor Ray Chapman. And it would only keep alive this tradition in Cleveland of naming their baseball team after a player, an Indians player, or a Cleveland player, I should say.
That'd be cool.
It would be. I think Bill's going to tell me that I should wrap things up. Did anyone else, was there one more question, Bill? Did anything else come in?
There is. Just one came in just as you started saying that from Frank. When did batting helmets become mandatory? And if it wasn't the Chapman incident that caused it, was there a specific reason at the time?
It didn't become fully integrated, batting helmets, that is, until 30 plus years later. But I think, and maybe Mike or Don can confirm, there were a few players that did use them immediately after in the ensuing decades too, in the 30s and 40s, but it didn't become a rule until 52, 3, somewhere around there.
Yeah, I think 1952 or 51. It was, so like you say, it was 30 something years later.
Mm-hmm.
My memory is, though, Mike, you have some stuff in your book about what the players did do immediately afterwards, right? Some of the Cleveland players.
Yeah, the following year in spring training, they tried what they called batting helmets, but they were like the old football leather helmets from that day. But you know, back then, these guys grew up playing baseball and they didn't wear helmets. And if you get up to the major leagues, that's suddenly a hindrance if for the first time you're going to adjust to wearing that. One other thing I think it's appropriate to mention is pitchers throwing at batters in there. And it strikes me, because we bring up Tony Conigliaro and, you know, Dickie Thon. There's a lot of other players whose careers have either ended or been disrupted by getting hit in the head by a pitch. It's a very serious thing. And I'm amazed that pitchers, when they're retaliating, which I understand why they do that, they still throw at the head. Because like Joe Kelly of the Dodgers, who, you know, former Red Sox pitcher, if he wants to throw these pitches at the Astros players and he's throwing behind them, but I find it curious that he's throwing at the head level behind them. So if he did throw a pitch that it came closer than he intended, he's going to hit them in the head. And even if it hits the helmet, you know, that it's just someone's bound to get hit in the face again. You know, a batting helmet didn't help Tony Conigliaro because he got hit. I think he hit him right in the eye. And so this is serious business, and something's going to happen one day. And so I don't understand why the pitchers still have to throw at the head level. They can make their point by throwing at the midsection.
You see a handful of players these days that have the extension on their pitcher side of the helmet that comes off the jaw because they have been hit in
Right.
the point.
Yeah.
You know.
If I
That's
could
a
add
really good point.
a quick point, Sharon. There were sometimes in the 40s, I know, team wore batting hat liners. I remember Pittsburgh wore only hard hats in the
I
50s.
remember that. They had to wear it the whole game.
Yeah,
So
they were the only team.
the players and the pitchers in the bullpen were sitting out there with hard hats on, and people were throwing peanuts at them.
Yeah.
But Pee Wee Reese was, I think, one of the first players in the 40s, early 40s. He started wearing what we call a batting helmet then. I played youth baseball in the 50s, and we wore those little wraparound things. They provided some protection, but not much. And I think Ted Williams was the only player who was grandfathered in who didn't have to wear a batting helmet once they mandated all the players had to wear them.
It is amazing it took so long after this
It is.
tragedy. It is amazing.
More than 30 years.
But as you pointed out, I found it fascinating in your book when you pointed out the football helmets, like there was no helmet designed for baseball. And that's the other thing, right? So it did take a while because it wasn't, even though it seemed like wearing a helmet should be a good idea, what would you wear, right? And you didn't want it to take away from your sight lines that you would need in baseball as well, right? So.
Well, and I know Don, you know, back in the 19th century, Don can speak on this, but the fact that the catchers didn't wear a mask, you know, it's just amazing that you're right there behind home plate where, you know, those little foul tips come straight back, and these guys are there not any protection on their face.
Well, I guess that if there's 19th century people on the line, then you know that it took them a long time even for catchers to have mitts. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, gloves didn't come in.
And a few feet further behind the batter in those days, often standing.
Look, I think we have to wrap things up, but this has been really wonderful, beyond wonderful. You are all really great panelists. This was actually kind of a dream of mine as someone who's really interested in Jazz Age baseball, to have a panel and to have it on the right day. I really feel that this is appropriate commemoration for someone who was a great ball player and a great person. So in tribute to Ray Chapman, this is special to be able to do this to the honor of his memory. Thank you for all of you who joined this conversation. And was there another comment that someone wanted to say? I thought I heard a sound. Bill's already mentioned this, but
I forgot to.
Sorry? Oh, hi, Vince.
I have to mute again.
There we go. I just wanted to reiterate what Bill said. This was the first activity of the brand new SABR Research Committee, that is the Century Research Committee, that we are interested in celebrating or commemorating important events in baseball, important milestones, especially from 100 years ago, but also 75 years ago, 25 years ago. If you're interested at all in this kind of work or these kinds of topics, we do encourage you to check out the description of our new committee, which is on the SABR Research Committee's website, and consider joining us. This is brand new, and we're welcoming ideas for the kinds of events that we could have. So again, thank you very much to our panelists and to all of you who attended this panel today. And thank you for your great questions. Lots of great stuff happening in the chat room the whole time. So that was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.